Hey everybody, it's time for a Rahdo Rules Run-Through with Ryan, and today we've got Dungeon and Kingdom. Ryan, how do we play this? Answer the call!
Thanks, Rahdo. Hi, it's Ryan from Knights Around a Table, and this is a prototype copy of Dungeon and Kingdom, a fantasy card game with a unique cutting mechanic. Asteria Games has asked me to teach you how to play, so let's get into it. Dungeon and Kingdom is a game of heroes and monsters. There's an array of cards in the middle of the table, and you and your friends take turns taking one card each. The cards you take go into a lineup in front of you from left to right. Eventually, you'll use one of the cards you draw to cut your line into two groups, Dungeon and Kingdom. In the Kingdom, your noble adventurers can defeat any monsters that are there in order to earn points. Any monsters you defeat wind up here in your monster graveyard. In the dungeon, you get to use the powerful abilities on your cards and even order the monsters around to do your bidding. But monsters, of course, are dangerous, and if you let them just hang around without controlling or defeating them, they'll steal your victory points. Some of your adventurers will wind up down here in your treasury, where they represent gems that you'll be able to cash in for points later on. At the end of the game, you earn points for the cards in your hand, your treasury, and your array. And you add those points to the points you've collected along the way to get your final score. Whoever has the most points by the time the deck runs out wins. The game kicks off with that 3x3 grid in the middle of the table, and 6 starting points to all players. That's because the monsters can steal your points, remember, so you gotta start out with some points for them to steal. Drawing and cutting. On your turn, you take any one card from the grid and add it to the right edge of the lineup in front of you. If you begin your turn and any of the rows or columns in the grid are empty, you get to fill them up from the draw deck first to give you more card choices. So if the grid looks like this, you gotta fill up this row before taking a card. And if it looks like this, you fill up this column. If a T shape or a cross of cards is missing, you get to fill up the row and column. But if the grid looks like this, where no single row or column is empty, you're hosed. You just get fewer choices when picking a card. So each card you take fills up your array, stretching right. If you take a card from the grid in the middle of the table that matches the color of one of the cards in your array, you can use that card to split your array into Dungeon and Kingdom, which is when all the cool stuff happens. So if you grab this green warrior card from the grid, because you have a matching green warrior in your array, you can use that card to cut your line. You decide which side of the green card gets cut. So you can cut here and split the cards this way, or you can cut here and split them this way. Your kingdom is always on the left, and your dungeon is always on the right. You can use a card to cut your array so that either your kingdom or dungeon is empty too. So here, if you grab a blue wizard card and cut here, your kingdom is empty, and your dungeon has these cards in it. Or here, if you use a purple ninja card to cut here, you'll get an empty dungeon. Any gray monster card will cut any other gray monster card. So you can use this hungry dragon card to cut your array on either side of this harpy. White princess cards are special because they're wild. That means that you can use a princess card to cut your line anywhere you want. Or if your array has a princess card in it, you can use a card of any color, including a white princess, to cut the line on either side of her. If you use an adventurer card to cut your line, it goes sideways into your treasury where it represents a gem. If you use a monster to cut your line, it goes sideways into your monster graveyard. Dungeon and Kingdom. Now that your line is cut into Dungeon and Kingdom, let's see what you can do on either side. On the Kingdom side, you want to defeat monsters with your adventurers. You can only defeat monsters that are in your kingdom. You can't fight the monsters in the dungeon. Each monster has a list of adventurers you'll need to defeat it. If you discard all the correct adventurers from your kingdom, you defeat the monsters. You get the number of points depicted in the top right corner of the monster card, and the monster goes into your monster graveyard. The adventurers you use to defeat it go to the discard pile in the middle of the table. When you're defeating monsters in your kingdom, you can use cards from your hand to defeat them too. We haven't actually seen how cards get into your hand, but that's coming up. Remember that princesses are wild, so you can use them in place of any single adventurer to help defeat monsters in the kingdom. Meanwhile, over here on the dungeon side, you can use your adventurer's abilities or control a monster to use its ability. To use an adventurer's ability, you simply discard it to the middle of the table. We'll get into more detail in a second, but the adventurers let you rearrange your cards, draw more cards from the deck, steal cards from other players, well, that type of thing. All in the name of trying to squeeze more points out of your turn. If you want to control a monster in your dungeon to use its ability, you have to discard a card from either your dungeon or your hand, along with the monster card. There's no particular order you have to follow when you're resolving cards in your dungeon and kingdom. You could discard this wizard to use his ability, which lets you put a card into your kingdom, which happens to be a monster, so you use these two guys and a card from your hand to defeat it. And then you use this guy to control this monster and earn extra points from the monster you just defeated, while this princess scores the gems in your treasury. You have to resolve your cards creatively in the order that gives you the most benefit. Aftermath. When you've finished, you may still have cards left in your kingdom and or dungeon. Any leftover adventurers in your kingdom go into your hand. The leftover adventurers in your dungeon go sideways into your treasury, where they now represent different colored gems that are worth endgame points. The leftover monsters each steal 2 victory points from your points pool. If you wound up with this situation, where you ended your turn with 1 or more monsters left over from a past turn who had already grabbed your victory points, then before these monsters raid your points, these monsters run away to the discard pile and take your points with them. So when you split your array, you get 2 shots at defeating or controlling monsters before they abscond with your victory points. By the way, if there's a monster in your dungeon with points on it from a previous turn, and you discard an adventurer to control that monster and use its ability, you do get to take your points back before discarding the monster. If you don't have enough points for the monsters to raid, you decide which monsters raid your points, and the monsters who didn't get to raid any points get booted out to the discard pile. Monsters are only after one thing, and if they can't have it, they jet. Once all that's done, you slide all your remaining monsters together, and then play continues with you taking your next turns adding new cards to the lineup one by one to the right of the array as play proceeds clockwise around the table. Before we get into what the adventurers do, there are a few limits you should know about. Your array maxes out at 7 cards. If it gets to your turn and you can't use a card from the middle of the table to cut your line, you go bust. You have to discard the useless card you took from the middle and wipe out your whole array to the discard pile. This is what we call in card games a very bad thing, so try not to let it happen. Likewise, there's a hand limit of 7 cards. Now, certain adventurers will allow you to draw new cards into your hand, and it's okay if your hand balloons up to over 7 cards during your turn, but then during that aftermath phase, you have to discard back down to 7 cards. Now let's take a look at the heroic deeds your adventurers can perform. Heroic deeds. Each adventurer in the dungeon has an ability you can use. The Green Warrior can gallop, which lets you move a card from the kingdom to the dungeon, or vice versa. And you can use her to do that twice. There are lots of different ways to use this ability, but here's a simple one. Let's say you split your line such that you have no monsters to fight in your kingdom. Use the warrior to move this monster from your dungeon to your kingdom, and then maybe one of the adventurers you need to help defeat it, and then discard adventurers as usual to defeat the monster and earn some points. The Yellow Captain's Battle Call ability lets you draw 3 new cards into your hand. You should never be able to have monsters in your hand, so if any of the cards you draw are monsters, throw them back in the deck and give it a quick shuffle, and then keep drawing until you've pulled 3 adventurers. Remember that you can use the cards in your hand to help defeat the monsters in your kingdom. So maybe you've got this monster, and you can't quite come up with the adventurers to defeat it. Well, you can use the captain to go fishing and hope that you draw the adventurers you need to defeat the monster. The Blue Wizard uses Summon to let you draw 5 cards from the deck. You choose one and sink the rest to the bottom of the deck. The card you choose goes into either your kingdom or your dungeon. Don't worry, the 7-card array limit doesn't apply at this point. Using the wizard might be another way to get a monster into your kingdom that you can fight, or the right adventurer to fight a specific monster. Or it may help you get a certain monster or adventurer into your dungeon that you can use to do other important points earning stuff. The purple ninja can kidnap a card from an opponent. Pick an opponent with the largest hand size, not including your own. If there's a tie for who's hoarding the most cards, you get to choose who to steal from. Look at that person's whole hand and then take the card you want into your hand. So this is similar to what the captain does, except you get one card instead of 3, and the card comes from an opponent's hand instead of blind from the draw deck. But if you've been paying attention to the cards everyone's been taking into their hands in the aftermath phase, chances are you'll be able to steal the exact card you need, or deprive an opponent of a specific card. Or maybe you just need some junk card in your hand to control a monster in your dungeon. The orange angel uses Navigate to let you pick a card from your hand, your kingdom, or your dungeon, and then turn it into your treasury as a gem. There are lots of reasons why this is a powerful ability. First, you can't normally use the cards in your kingdom or your hand for their powers, but the angel lets you. Second, whenever you use a card's ability, it usually gets discarded to the center of the table. But the angel lets you hang on to it in your treasury, where it's worth at least half a point at the end of the game. And third, you can combo the angel with the captain or the ninja so that when you get 3 blind cards or 1 stolen card into your hand, you can actually use one of those cards. Where normally, the cards in your hand are generally only useful for fighting monsters in your kingdom or controlling monsters in your dungeon. If you defeat a monster this turn and you use a Red Knight's Valor ability, you score 2 additional points for defeating that monster. And the White Princess's ability is called Happiness. The gems in your treasury are all worth half a point at the end of your game, but the princess lets you score them for more points. Discard her to cash in 1 gem for 2 points, or 2 of a kind for 5 points, or 3 of a kind for 9 points. The gems you cash in go into the discard pile. And yes, if a princess ends up in your treasury, she's still wild, so she counts as any color of gem. The monster's abilities are pretty powerful, so you have to discard a card either from your hand or from the dungeon in order to control one. The 2-headed Cyclops Orthos gets you double power, so you get to use the ability of the controlling adventurer twice. There are lots of different ways this can play out, but here's one scenario. You've got this monster in your kingdom and nobody who can defeat it, but you've got all these adventurers in your dungeon. And if only they were over here, they could fight that monster. So you use the green warrior in your hand to control Orthos, which lets you use the warrior's Gallop ability twice. Remember that Gallop lets you shift cards between your kingdom and dungeon up to 2 times. So you shift these 2 cards over to your kingdom, that's one use, and another 2 cards over to your kingdom, that's the second use. Now you've got everyone you need in your kingdom to murder this monster, which you happily do. The Demon King's power is called Dark Glory, and he's like a super-powered knight. He gets you an additional 4 points for one of the monsters you defeat this turn. The Hungry Dragon has the Devour ability. You name a color of gem, say yellow, and then you take all of the gems of that color from your treasury and everybody else's treasury, and score 1 point for all of those gems before discarding them. What a jerk! If you control the Harpy, her Grapple ability lets you steal a card from an opponent's array and put it in your kingdom or dungeon. So she's like a souped-up ninja wizard hybrid. Controlling the Giant Robot lets you defeat a monster in someone else's array. The Giant Robot's Conquer ability lets you pick someone else's monster and use adventurers from your kingdom or your hand to defeat it, with a 1 adventurer discount. So this monster would only cost you 1 adventurer to defeat. The monster goes into your monster graveyard and you get the points for it, along with any points that may have been sitting on the card. If you made a hole in your opponent's array, the cards should slide over and fill the gap. And finally, the Undead Reaper has an ability called Requiem that lets you score extra points for the defeated monsters in your monster graveyard. Usually these monster cards aren't worth any points over and above the VPs you collected when you defeated them. But the Undead Reaper brings those monsters back to life to get you 1 point each before you discard them to the middle of the table. Endgame. The game ends when the draw deck is exhausted and all of the remaining cards have been taken from the grid. At the end of the game, count up each card in your array, your hand, and your treasury. Divide that number by 2, rounding down. Add that number to the number of points you earned in tokens, and the player with the most points wins. In the case of a tie, all tied players win the game. Setup. Setup is a breeze. Give everyone 6 victory points to start. The rest go in a pile. Shuffle up the main deck, deal out 9 cards, and you're ready to go. The first player is whoever can name the video I've done with the shortest setup segment. And now you're ready to play Dungeon and Kingdom.
Thanks, Ryan. I think we've got it. And if you folks would like to learn a little bit more about this game, you can follow the links that are on the screen right now or down in the show notes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.